You're listening to The Pipeline, the Western Standards National Affairs program, recording this Sunday, April 5th, 2020. Each week, except for the last few, we break down the issues, discuss them in depth, and examine some of the broader implications for Western Canada and beyond, featuring from Calgary, the Western Standards publisher, Derek Fildebrandt. Derek, how are you today?
Alive and quarantined.
Excellent. And featuring also Deirdre Mitchell-McLean from Strathmore, a senior reporter with the Western Standard. How are you, Deirdre?
Really wishing for some sunshine.
Yep. Well, you can have all of ours because I'm not going outside anyway. And finally featuring Dave Naylor from Calgary, the Western Standard's news editor. Dave, how are you this fine day?
Paul, I'm feeling inspired at the moment. Just
Awesome.
finished watching Her Majesty the Queen's message to the world, and really, what a message, what a woman, what a leader she has been for so many years now.
Outstanding. And we will begin with that topic. The other topics we're going to talk about today are pandemic pop culture, something about Trump and 3M and masks, and a little bit about government overreach and whether or not this governments are taking too much advantage of the current situation and what that could mean for the future. We'll leave that for last because that's going to be a lengthy and contentious discussion, I'm sure. But Dave, why don't you tell us your story about the Queen?
Well, first of all, I was born in Britain, so the Queen is a huge part of my life. Back in must have been around 1995, the Queen did a royal tour through Canada and stopped in Calgary. And I was in charge of the Calgary Sun's royal tour coverage at the time. And I got a cardboard gold embossed invitation. Her Majesty commands you, didn't invite me, she commanded me to come down to a cocktail reception at the Crystal Ballroom in the Palace. So you go down there and stand in line, and you get up to the door, and a doorman screams out, Your Majesty, Dave Naylor. And she's there standing by herself in the middle of the room, and you walk over and you shake her hand, and she's really tiny, like really, really tiny. So then once everybody's introduced, she mingles around and talks to small people one-on-one. So there was a group of three of us, myself, one of my reporters, and the opposition from the Calgary Herald. And just as she approached our group, they came by with hors d'oeuvres, which the Calgary Herald reporter took and was still chewing as the Queen arrived. So as we made our introductions again, the Herald reporter actually spit a piece of food onto the Queen's shoulder. We watched it go gracefully through the air, all three of us just watching in horror as it landed on the Queen's shoulder. So you can imagine the sharp intake of breath amongst the group, and we were all worried we were going to end up in the Tower of Calgary or whatever the closest penal institution was. But certainly one of my top memories of my life, being able to have a gin and tonic with the Queen and some really good, one-on-one time for 5 or 6 minutes.
How gracious was she about the food landing on her?
You know what? In her career, I'm assuming that's not the worst thing that's ever happened to her. She did not bat an eye and continued as though nothing had happened.
Wow. Incredible. What did you think about we'll go around the circle here, but Dave, maybe start with you. What did you think about her address to, to the world today?
Well, it's only the 5th time she's done it, and she brought up earlier addresses that she made with Princess Margaret during the war and whatnot. I thought she hit on all the high points. She commended the National Health Service workers in England, the emergency workers, people staying at home. She does what she always does. She's a pillar of strength in a time of need. So, England's being very hard hit now, hundreds and hundreds of deaths a day. So hopefully everybody over there can take some strength out of it.
Mm-hmm. Deirdre, did you watch the Queen's address today?
I did. I was able to catch it. It was quick.
Mm-hmm.
So that helped. I was almost really hoping for a stern reminder to people to please follow public health orders. She went in a different direction, and how did she put it? I hope that everyone can look back on basically how they behaved during this pandemic and be proud of their actions.
Right.
So, a little more encouraging than what I was hoping for a stay the F home. I know I wasn't going to get that, but I was kind of hoping for a slight version.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Fair enough. Derek, did you get a chance to listen to the Queen's address?
No, I wasn't aware of it until we were about to start. So I have nothing to say on this matter.
It's interesting. I'm not a monarchist. I imagine Dave, you certainly are. I've never been a huge. I don't feel any particular connection to the Queen, but I've never been a huge Republican either. I don't think we need to necessarily ditch the system we have, because there's pros and cons of every system. But it's there's no question the Queen in her lifetime has just really done some incredible things. And you can't say that about every monarch in history. There's been a lot of terrible ones.
Yeah.
And so it's hard not to respect an incredible woman who has just seen so much and, managed to keep a stiff upper lip, as the British are so well known for throughout so many crises. So that's encouraging. Great note to start on. Now we're going to go to a bit of a lighter note, but not too light. Still kind of weird. Reflecting upon the pop culture of the day. It's amazing how when suddenly we go from quote normal to the situation we're in right now, where more than half the world is staying at home and probably increasing in those numbers every day. We get the likes of Tiger King happening on Netflix, which, might have in an ordinary time just been a passing thing, but because it was promoted by Netflix and everybody's staying at home with nothing better to do than watch Netflix, it's become this massive pop culture hit. And Derek, I understand you are a big fan of the Tiger King.
Yes.
No spoilers though, but you can tell us how maybe this has changed your life.
I don't watch anything like the Tiger King normally. It's not my cup of tea, that kind of thing normally. But it hit at this exact moment where we're all sitting sort of as a captive audience, and it's become almost the decade is young, but in this bizarre short decade we've had so far, we've narrowly avoided a massive war across the Middle East. We've had the daily circus of the White House. And then we've had the Tiger King. And the Tiger King, Joe Exotic, is, I think, so far in the short decade we've had so far, he is the symbol of the decade. He's this huge phenomenon that everybody's looking to almost as a source of comfort and lightheartedness, I think, in the otherwise very dark and dreary time. Everyone's locked down. The economy is in the absolute toilet across the world. Particularly in Alberta, because we're hit with the double whammy of oil prices, Western Canadian Select slipping below $5. So now it's cheaper to buy a pint of beer in Alberta than a barrel of oil. But I don't know. It's just this wild thing that you must watch. Almost no one's watched it. I suppose some of the few people who haven't are on this show. But it blows my mind. It is the craziest thing. I mean, it has changed things the way The Simpsons has in a very short period of time. Like, you can't have an extensive conversation in the English language in North America without understanding The Simpsons references that you would use without even meaning to. They're almost like Shakespeare. They're just kind of embedded into the language. And now, I mean, it's there's all these Tiger King references now that have already started to creep into our language. As just pop culture references, and it's happened in such a short period of time. I don't know how enduring it's going to be or not, but when you joke about feeding your husband to the tigers, there's a very specific meaning about it now. And so Deirdre has a confused look on her face, but that's because she doesn't understand where culture has changed in the last few weeks. She needs to watch the Tiger King.
Deirdre, do you need to watch the Tiger King?
Deirdre is trying to calm her stomach because the idea of sitting and watching the Tiger King just makes me kind of ill.
There's other things that can make you ill right now. I think that's the best option.
There is. Yes, and the whole idea of the captive audience. I would literally have to be tied up, I think, to be that captive.
Like a tiger in a cage, almost.
Yes,
Yeah.
I'd have to be a tiger in a cage. And this is probably size-wise, my office is probably close, but still have other options.
I think what's interesting about it, and I grew up in the 80s mostly, in my formative years. I was born in the 70s. But, I remember a time, Derek, you wouldn't remember this, certainly, and probably not Deirdre. But I remember a time when there was 13 channels on the television, and we only really watched 5 of them. And one of them was not CBC. Actually, 2 of them were CBC, but nobody actually watched them, except maybe for the news. But there was a pop culture. When there was a popular show, everybody watched that popular show. You talked about The Simpsons before as an example of that. And in the media landscape where, like, I have a kid who doesn't watch Netflix, certainly has never watched cable in his life. He watches YouTube, and occasionally we see YouTube pop culture arise to the top and be, so-and-so who's like the big YouTuber. And it's like, who? Right. And so there's a massive disconnect in our society when it comes to anything close to pop culture. And so when something like this comes along on Netflix and everybody watches it because it's the featured program, it's almost, to me, it's almost a little bit nostalgic in the sense that even though it's silly and it's a distraction and everything else, which is maybe a good thing right now, I do sort of think that it's an interesting cultural phenomenon to have anything close to the same level of popular culture as what I grew up with. So it's a bit different. Dave, you're muted there, but
if you grew up with 12 channels, consider yourself lucky. I grew up with 3, so I asked.
How many of those were the CBC?
Just one, I think.
Just one.
Remember, we got Hockey Night in Canada and the Beachcombers. I asked a very intelligent friend of mine who had watched the Tiger King, and I hadn't at the time, to explain it to me. And he says, "Dave, I can't. I really can't. You just have to watch it." Yeah. So I started watching it, and my jaw got lower and lower and lower. And then by the end of the first episode, it was on the ground. Literally every character that is introduced in this documentary, it's true story. It's not fake.
Every one of them can have their own show. Every single person on the Tiger King can have their own show.
And each one of them would be a huge hit. And I binge watched it. I must admit, I think I watched it over 2 nights. And I got my own Joe Exotic shirt going on. So,
commemorative 2020 Joe Exotic shirt.
It really is. It's an eye-opener because there's a subculture going on in the States that really nobody knew about. And it's in this trade of exotic animals. And this is shedding a light on it, so there may be some good coming out of it. But it really is a jaw-dropper. It really is.
Speaking of dropping, you dropped a hint of a CBC show that some of us might admit to having watched, The Beachcombers. Did you watch The Littlest Hobo as well?
Oh yeah.
I didn't do that one. No.
Oh really?
No.
I thought The Littlest Hobo was like the greatest hero on television. I got to admit.
Bigger than
it always made me cry at the end though.
I know. Well, because he left.
He left.
I mean, come on, like you found this great family and they love you and you saved their Billy from the well and then.
Well, my German Shepherds are going to be dressed up as tigers for Halloween. And my toddler.
Oh jeez! Why don't you dress your? You could borrow Dave's shirt for your toddler.
Well, we haven't decided if I'm the Tiger King, the meth boyfriend, or Carol's dead husband. I'm thinking of going as. So.
All right. So
I've got some time.
So so there's a lot of Tiger King memes. We've seen a lot of memes of 2020. I saw one that was actually on a shirt, and it showed a a dumpster with fire coming out of the top, and emblazoned on the dumpster was 2020. And I really thought that was an appropriate meme for the moment. Anything else stand out to you, fine folks? It's nice to see a little bit of humor in the middle of what's obviously a bit of a, obviously for a lot of people, a very personal tragedy, and for all of us, a very trying time. But, I guess it's nice that we can all take a moment and laugh, I suppose. Mm-hmm. Anything else, Deirdre, Dave?
One of the best ones that I've seen is I would like to return my subscription for 2020. I've tried it for 3 months and I'm done.
Yep. Hear, hear. Lots of time machine references. I saw one the other day where Kirk and Spock went into the time portal and they said, we got to go to 2020. And on the way out, we're like, let's never do that again.
Also, yep. I think that's fair.
We're not that far into 2020 either, are we?
I know. Yeah, we got another. Well, and what's interesting is we had all this happen, and then on the West Coast there was a earthquake. I think it was in Russia, and then there was a tsunami warning. So we got a tsunami.
I did see that.
We got a tsunami. This was a few weeks ago now, but we got a tsunami warning. Apparently, there's also locusts in various places.
This is getting biblical.
Very biblical. So I tweeted out saying that when the rivers run with blood, please let me know. And sure enough, literally that day,
Ontario,
there was an ink spill in Ontario, and it actually turned the I don't know if it was a river or a creek or what it was.
It was in the dam.
Is it in the dam? Yeah, and it literally turned the water red.
Yeah.
And I thought, okay, just flipping through Revelation at this point and waiting for the seventh seal to open. Yeah, very, very, very different times, certainly than the last time we even met as a group. So, yeah. Anything else on pop culture before we move along to the 3M?
Well, actually, I don't know if I'd say that it's pop culture, but we are living in what will become a historically significant event. Yeah. And I also did see, again, somebody else, I think it was just a tweet, but they were saying that living in times that are making history is exhausting. And we're getting, for the first time, for a lot of us, we're getting an idea of exactly how exhausting that is.
Yeah. Yeah. And actually the interesting part of this is, families and people being stuck together. Obviously, if you like the people you're stuck with, it's a little bit better, but you can imagine people who are stuck with people they do not get along with, and, terrible potential outcomes there. My wife and I, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think we're gonna have a simultaneous baby boom in 9 months and divorce boom.
Yeah, possibly.
Hopefully from different families, but maybe the same.
Maybe the same. In 1996, Victoria, where I'm from, had a giant snow blast, which was probably like any ordinary winter in Calgary, but was unheard of for Victoria, and shut down the entire city for a week. We couldn't actually even leave our apartment for about a week. And my girlfriend at the time, now my wife, was stuck with me for a week. And we always look back at how crazy that time was, being stuck together for a week. Couldn't leave, couldn't come, couldn't go. It was terrible. And now we're on week 4.
Back in 1996, Victoria got a snowstorm and the world stood still.
Oh, no. It's legend in Victoria. It's called the Blizzard of 96. And yeah, it was probably an average Calgary winter, but we don't have machines to blow that snow out of the way and scrape it and whatever else.
Or winter tires.
Snow. Winter tires weren't even useful at that point because cars were entirely covered anyway, with no roads to drive them on, even if you did dig them out. So it literally shut down the town. But obviously,
why don't we move on to
we've seen it now. It shut down the world. Yeah, let's talk. Why don't you go first, Derek? Tell me about Donald Trump's directive about the 3M masks?
Well, yeah, most people know 3M makes a lot of kind of random supplies and whatnot, and it's a large American corporation. It's integrated throughout North America. It's got some plants in Ontario. It gets many of its resources for its manufacturing from places in Canada. Donald Trump, they're one of the largest protective face mask manufacturers right now, and Donald Trump, I'm not sure if we could say ordered, because I'm not sure he has the authority to order a private corporation to do that, because it's not government, but essentially told them to stop shipping to other countries until America's needs were met. It's probably not the nicest thing to do with allies, but I don't think anyone should be surprised that the American president should be looking out for Americans first. But it wasn't entirely well thought out, because I know, as Deirdre will surely point out if I don't get the jump on her first, 3M requires much of its raw materials from Canada. So if Canada was being unduly harmed by this, Canada could then stop shipping much of the raw materials that it needs for the manufacture of these things. So this is sort of one of the problems when politicians get involved in trying to direct private corporations, private entities that are not government, into doing their bidding. Canadian politicians, though, hyperventilated a fair bit about this. Of course, most Canadian politicians want an opportunity to take a shot at Trump. Kenny used some particularly strange language. He compared this to America not fighting the Nazis for the first 3 years of the Second World War.
Ouch.
Trying to invoke Canada being there at the beginning with Britain alone. It was a very strange comparison to make. I think there's a very good argument that it's being a bad ally. Pandemics don't really recognize borders. You could lock down borders to a degree, but if there's probably the most difficult border to lock down on the planet would be the Canada-US border. And so the United States has very much an interest in making sure that we have a handle on COVID-19 as much as they do. They need us to have it under control. Otherwise, anything they do is going to be useless. So it was probably a poor move, although I think people should spare the outrage about the American president being America first. That's what he was elected to do. But it was not the most well thought out move, and it's certainly opened him up to shots from politicians around the world and in Canada.
Well, his shoot from the hip style certainly serves him in some cases and doesn't serve him so well in other cases. Deirdre,
I'm shocked. A Trump policy that wasn't well thought out, Derek?
It's incredible, isn't it?
He never just thinks of policies on the top of his mind. Surely he wouldn't do that.
The other premier that took him to task was Ford in Ontario.
Right.
And I just wanted to mention his handling of the crisis as a whole has been exemplary. And it's been interesting to see the left-wing critics of Ford slowly coming around and admitting, yeah, okay, he's doing all right. And I never thought I'd say that, but Ford is doing okay. That's not happening in Alberta yet. None of Jason Kenney's opposition are giving him credit at all. I personally think Kenny's done all right. I think he's done okay, but he's certainly not getting any credit from the left wing.
Well,
let's circle back to that, because I think I want to hear what Deirdre has to say on the 3M mask, but let's talk about the various politicians after. Deirdre, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, so yes, obviously that was a big part of what Trump's statement about 3M was absolutely, hey everybody, keep these for us. America first. No one was shocked. Again, that little known fact about how it's the pulp from Canada that actually makes those masks possible. Mm-hmm. So again, little known fact that, America first doesn't really look too much to when they're not actually first. So when that came out, but the thing is that Donald Trump did invoke the Defense Production Act, which he has dubbed the P Act, or the Defense Production Act. So that is basically for him to be able to force companies to create certain products. Just as an interesting comparison, Jason Kenney, there's a shout out-ish, but also at the federal level, they are asking companies, what can you do? How can you contribute to this? They're not forcing anyone to do anything at this time, but they're saying, how can you be retooled? How can you help? So yet again, just a little different way of doing things. Sometimes if you ask, because a lot of companies want to keep working, they want to keep producing, they want to keep selling, they may need to retool.
Mm-hmm.
So
making ventilators instead of cars apparently
right.
is another thing. And interestingly, apparently it's a Vancouver Island pulp mill that produces most
Yes.
of that paper for just north of where I am. So hooray for us making the raw materials of the masks that our healthcare workers need.
Every so often you're losing your arm.
We're using the Zoom app, and we have
Yes.
actually before it became trendy, and it does these virtual backgrounds for anybody listening in. So one of the things I wanted to point out on the political side before we kind of just scooch back into various political things, I've noticed in Alberta, the NDP's still playing politics a fair bit with this. You guys would know more than me. What I found really fascinating here in British Columbia, even though we have a NDP minority government that's only just sort of barely propped up by the Greens, the BC Liberals and Andrew Wilkinson, neither of whom I'm a particularly big fan of, but they are the primary opposition here as a result of the coalition. They came right out at the very beginning and said, you know what, this is really serious. We're not playing politics with this. We're going to, if we see an opportunity to make suggestions to help the government to make better decisions, we're going to do so. But we're not going to be political right now. And it was shocking to see, honestly, and how people can lay down their weapons and not have to demonize their opponents during a time of crisis. And it gives me a little bit of hope for humanity that we can see that from our politicians. Maybe we can see that.
How lucky for you.
Yeah, well, and as I understand, that's not exactly how things are going down in Alberta. So why don't we go around the horn here and just jump in if you want to sort of talk. I don't know if you guys want to talk about the situation in Alberta.
Yeah, well, I think it's very important to touch on. I haven't studied every single province in depth, but I've been watching BC, Saskatchewan, and Ontario in particular, those three outside of Alberta, and of course federally. And for the most part, it's been as you described from the BC situation. You can apply that across most of the country. I can tell you from my experience being in opposition during a crisis when we had the Fort McMurray fires, oppositions don't really know what to do with themselves. The only way they ever get printed in the media is when they take a hard shot at the government. If they're not taking hard shots, they get ignored. People ask, well, why don't the oppositions get along with the government? It's because if they get along with government, they get ignored, and so they have to attack. And they don't really know what to do with themselves during a crisis. But during the Fort McMurray fires, the Wild Rose, we were right in the middle. When that happened, we were in the middle of the budget debates in a budget where the NDP had actually significantly cut the forest firefighting budget. But we holstered our guns. We made sure that it was about helpful, constructive ideas during a crisis. There's enough going on for the government. And it's frustrating for oppositions because it's really the bureaucrats in charge. The politicians are just more or less, they're making a few decisions, but they're more or less just doing what the bureaucrats tell them to do. They're there just as spokespeople of the government while the bureaucrats enact the plans that have been in place before that. And so it's actually pretty easy for politicians to look good, government politicians, not opposition politicians, but for government politicians to look good during a crisis. Of course, they can mess that up, but the default is that they're going to look good because there's actually smart people running these things in the background of the bureaucracy. And across the country, opposition politicians have understood people don't want to see politics for this. But Alberta's really been a huge exception. The NDP have not taken their foot off the gas and going after the government, and that's fine. Like they are the opposition, but they've really tried to politicize this as much as possible to score points and at the government's expense on this. And I understand the temptation. That's what oppositions want to do. But the NDP in Alberta have never reconciled themselves to the fact that they lost. That, you know, they are not the natural governing party of Alberta. They are a socialist party in a very non-socialist province. And they never really brought themselves around to understand that they lost. And it's just been very difficult for them to accept this. And, you know, Notley was in charge during the Fort McMurray fires. By most observers would say she did a good job. And she's now sitting on the sidelines. People don't really care what they have to say. And so they've been, I think, not comporting themselves very well as an official opposition during a crisis here.
Thoughts, Deirdre? I saw your eyes go wide during some of that.
Okay, so that's definitely one perspective, Derek.
It's the correct one.
Yes, I'm sure. I would have to say that you can't, I mean, looking at the situation that we have now, without taking into account some of the context, remember that a lot of things have been done since the NDP lost, and whether they are the natural governing party or not, they, you know, the UCP has spent a lot of time taking apart a lot of the things that the NDP did. They're, you know, as far as education goes, doctors, these are things that were leading up to this crisis. So the doctor pay thing just went through. Doctors are still saying that they are not being paid for certain things. The thing that I was reading about today was the good faith clause, where, you know, if someone...
There's a lot of room to criticize government.
Oh, there is.
And oppositions should not be giving blank checks to governments here. They shouldn't be granting them unreasonable powers, and they shouldn't be uncritical of government. But they shouldn't be trying to take whatever issues are there at that moment to try and undermine the government in the middle of a crisis. That's just not a responsible opposition. When the Fort McMurray fires were happening, they were cutting the forest fire budget. It was literally before the legislature
and did that come up at all? Do you remember?
It did, but we were criticizing it before the fires, but then we waited till the immediate crisis had passed. Now that was a shorter term crisis because a fire burns out a bit faster than a pandemic. Once that crisis passed, then we leapt at them, then we went back for the jugular. But during the actual middle of that crisis, while fires were burning, we holstered our guns on those things because we thought it was the responsible thing to do as an opposition.
Right. Do you remember hearing that sundry doctors have said that they will not be going into hospitals to deliver babies because they are no longer getting paid for it?
Yeah. There are very fair issues to deal with here.
2 days ago.
Yeah, Deirdre, there are very fair issues to deal with here, and the NDP is under no obligation to not be critical of the government. They should be. That's their job. It's their job to make life difficult. But if you're keeping up with the daily barrage of news releases from these guys,
which I'm not.
They are trying very much to try and score points at every available opportunity, some of which are fair, some of which are not.
Right. And there is too much going on right now for them. Like question period is a complete waste of time. The gotcha moments that they're going for is ridiculous to me at this point. They're still conducting themselves in a way that as if we're not in the middle of a pandemic, and that is bothersome. But they also don't really seem to have a government that is interested in working with their opposition. So
I don't remember the last government that was willing to work with opposition, with the brief exception of Jim Prentice trying to eat it. Governments don't work with official oppositions in any province or federally. They hate each other because
they are.
Because no, it's a zero-sum game.
In other provinces.
Oh, in other sure.
Well, they're getting along. They're choosing to get along. I think
that's right. It's a choice.
In other provinces, there's been a level of détente. You know, I'm no apologist for Jason Kenney here, but I think he's tried to be reasonably nonpartisan in dealing with the opposition during this crisis, at least, and that's very rare. He tends to not like working with other parties, but that's the nature of our system. But the NDP here have made themselves intractable on this. And I think it's just because they've never accepted that they lost the election. I lost the election. I accepted it. I moved on. But the NDP, they just can't bring themselves. But they've also got this weird view that Jason Kenney is practically a fascist. So for them, it's a life or death situation when things have not actually changed that much.
Dave,
But by the way, Alberta is this huge exception here, where around the rest of the country, the daily petty back and forth of politics that is par for the course has been mostly shelved, but not in Alberta, where it's been virtually like nothing's changed.
and we won't talk about how petty politics continues down south. Dave, your thoughts on Alberta?
To be brief, I'm on Team Derek.
Team Derek.
Team Derek.
If only he was the premier right now, right?
The NDP is irrelevant in Alberta at the moment. What they think is irrelevant, what they want to do is irrelevant, and they just can't handle that. And they're lashing it, for lack of a better word. But
yeah,
Team Derek all the way. Rah, rah.
it's an interesting.
I accept.
It's an interesting thing to watch. And, before we kind of move on to the next topic, which ties in nicely, I got to tell you something. I remember when there were the fires in Fort McMurray vividly. We actually had a big conference in Victoria I was at and was running. And we all stopped and put a slide up for the donation to the victims. And everybody in the room, from all over Canada, was in agreement that this was a national crisis and we all needed to step up. Fort McMurray was an interesting experience in that sense because everybody knew somebody there because so many people who worked there came from other places across Canada. And so, and for anybody who's listening who is an Alberta or Western separatist, I got to say the Fort McMurray experience was, for me anyway, a moment of national pride when I was able to see Canadians from all over, including Quebec and including Maritimes and all over, come together for a common cause. And I'd like to see that again during this circumstance. I make no mistake in thinking that this is going to be normal anymore, that people are just all going to agree and we're all going to hold hands and sing Kumbaya, and that shouldn't be the case. But it's nice to see when people can come together during a crisis, and let's hope Alberta does that as well. That being said, we're going to flip the script a little bit. We're going to talk about never letting a good crisis go to waste. And obviously there's a lot of concern right now for the impact on the economy. A lot of people are saying, is the treatment going to hurt more people than the disease, right? In terms of economic impact. I think it's a legitimate question to ask. I have my personal opinions about that, but I think it's a legitimate question to ask. And then, of course, the other question is the erosion of liberties. If people are being forced to stay home or being forced, to do things that that they government wouldn't ordinarily demand of us. Is that going to be a new normal, or is that a temporary thing, and we can expect to go back to normal and return our liberties once this happens? And I think there's a lot to open up there. I don't know who wants to jump in first, but Dave. Maybe you have some thoughts in general.
Well, my first thought is that this is not going to be over quickly. I think we're going to be in this sort of situation, I'm thinking, until at least the end of summer. I may be wrong. I hope I'm wrong. Right now, all of Canada owes a big debt to the handful of conservative politicians who stopped Prime Minister Trudeau's huge spending grab that he was trying to put through last week. That would have freed up the government to spend and tax whatever the hell they wanted, as much as they wanted, all the way until the end of 2021. So that's the type of thing, while we're in quarantine and not being able to do much, that's what we have to keep an eye out for. And as journalists, those are the stories that we should be chasing, just to keep the Liberals in check from what they want to do, to keep their power in hand, so to speak.
Deirdre, your thoughts?
I don't see this ending before the summer. There's a larger concern that once we start to get rid of some of the restrictions that we have on our daily lives, that the virus will come back, because we won't be able to completely eradicate it until we have a vaccine. So, I mean, I think that we're looking at a much different normal between now and the time that we get that vaccine.
Derek, your thoughts?
I want to touch on what Dave was into. You know, federally, the different parties seem to have holstered their guns, as they have in most of the provinces across the country. But the Liberals took it uniquely, and I haven't seen this in any other province. The Liberals took it as a unique opportunity for a wild power grab to essentially suspend Parliament and hand all lawmaking powers over budgets, the ability to raise taxes and spend money. The whole reason we created parliaments in the 1200s and chopped off kings' heads over was so that the executive had to have legislative approval for taxes and spending, was just to be handed over unilaterally to the Liberals until the end of 2021. That would have made the minority Liberal government more powerful than the majority Liberal government that came before it. It was a wild power grab that would have kept them in office without any parliamentary oversight. They wouldn't have had to call Parliament until the end of 2021, and they could govern as if they, more than if they had a majority government. And the Bloc Québécois rolled over on it. The federal NDP didn't like it. They opposed it, but not very hard. And the Conservatives grew a bit of a spine on this one. But the Conservatives rolled over on a lot of stuff. They rolled over on a lot of the spending that was actually in the end passed by the Liberal government. The Conservatives agreed to a vast majority of it. They made some suggestions for changes, some of which were actually implemented. But the Conservatives rolled over on quite a bit. I think understanding that the public sentiment is that they don't want parties playing hardball. But they did dig in over the emergency powers grab that the Liberals intended. But it's not just in Canada. You see this Hungary. They actually did succeed in doing away with Parliament for an extended period of time here, or at least temporarily, where Viktor Orban is now going to govern by decree. Where I posted... the problem is so many people are willing to trust governments with extraordinary, extreme powers if they like the politicians in charge, not suspicious of the nature of government itself. I mean, I shared that Viktor Orban in Hungary had succeeded in doing this, and he's a right-wing, anti-European Union kind of guy. You know, I think a lot of our readers would be sympathetic with at least some of what he stands for. And but a lot of our readers are saying, well, it doesn't matter that he did it, but Trudeau tried to do it because he's good. Yeah, well, sure, but Trudeau's fans trust him. And the point is that we should never trust government with these extraordinary powers. We didn't hand over all legislative powers to the cabinet during 2 world wars. Now, those governments did invoke the War Measures Act, now renamed the Emergencies Act, and they did assume an extraordinary amount of power. And most of that power is never handed back. When governments go into crises, they assume new powers in wars, in these kinds of disasters. And when the crisis passes, they hand back some of those powers, but never all of them. And that's why in the United States, Donald Trump has the authority to order companies to start producing things. And that is a hangover from the First World War. Income taxes are a hangover from world wars, for God's sakes. These things never go away. And you've got a lot of politicians out there right now, including Catherine McKenna, senior Liberal cabinet minister, who's very openly stating that the growth in the size of government during this crisis should be put to use after it has passed to fight global warming. And what that does by politicizing it like this, by adding a very clear ideological dimension to this, is it can break down the consensus that's been people are trying to achieve across the political spectrum to have a consensus on how to deal with this, with the crisis at hand. But why should we trust governments with these greater powers if so many of their leading members are stating that once this crisis is passed, they want to use these new powers for other ideological ends?
Yeah, it's interesting. We've seen this in the States a lot, but also in Canada is this concentration of powers at the executive level. You know, a number of when Obama was popular and everybody loved Obama, and he was handed several powers. Nobody questioned the executive privilege that he took to put in to basically pass edicts, if you will. in America. And then as soon as a president comes in that's, that the same people that might have handed those powers to Obama didn't like, suddenly those powers are no good, right?
Well, this is the nature. The pro-Constitution party is always the party out of power.
Exactly.
When President Obama was in power, Republicans lost their mind about executive overreach and the need of Congress to constrain the executive. As soon as Trump wins, they forget all of that, and they think the president should have total power. And then the Democrats, who had no concern about it when Obama's in power, all of a sudden they start banging away about the Constitution. The same thing happens in Canada. The opposition parties are always talking about the rights of Parliament to hold the government to account. And then as soon as they get elected, they don't care anymore. It's the same thing. And unfortunately, that's just, I think, the nature of politics, is that you only care about restricting power of government when you're not the government.
Totally. Yeah. And the power of precedent can be incredible in practice. When you bestow power upon an office, don't be surprised when somebody who you don't like takes that office and turns that power into something horrible. It's essentially what happened with the rise of the Nazis in Germany.
Well, that's a bit further than I was going to go.
A little different, but no, not to say that is the outcome.
Here in Alberta,
but
the NDP complained whenever the Tories invoked closure to shut down debate on bills. Well, I was there. They did it every damn day that they felt like it. As soon as they got any pushback that was taking too long, they would invoke closure. Then they lose power. The Tories come in, and the Tories can say, "Hey, we're just doing what you did." And so when it comes to parties fighting against governments abusing powers, sometimes it's principled, but for the most part, they're just complaining that they're not able to abuse the power themselves. Exactly.
Yeah, and that's exactly my point. And obviously, you're not going to take it to the extreme, but the process of concentrating power rarely leads to great outcomes, or certainly consensus building outcomes. Any final thoughts, Deirdre or Dave, on the state of the world today?
Yeah, I just think we should have a office pool amongst all Western Standard readers or listeners to try and pick the date Justin Trudeau is going to come out of his cottage and actually become a leader, a world leader. Because I don't know if he realizes the internet joke that he's become by hiding in his cottage every day and not going to work. Maybe he thinks if he sees his shadow, we're going to get 2 more months of winter or something. But he's got to get out of that cottage.
Deirdre, don't have to talk about the cottage.
Let's see.
But you may.
I think something that we all appreciate when we are being told to stay at home and work from home is that our leaders do it as well. Jason Kenney, Tyler Shandro doing his hospital rounds and shaking hands with hospital employees during this did not go over well, and it shouldn't have gone over well. This is precisely the sort of behavior we're asking everyone else to not do, and they're out there doing them. So I guess that I would say, watch what you are watch what you're complaining about, right? What are you asking other people to do? Practice it yourself. Be a good example.
He's the prime minister, Deirdre. He's the prime minister. He's the leader of the country.
Yes, and we also don't want him to get sick and die. Well, yeah, most of us. But yeah, I'm even willing to protect the opposition. Yeah, even willing to protect the other people too. Just stop the photo ops, especially in hospitals. Like, come on, that's just gross.
I have no time for people who wish this disease upon their opponents. That's just crass. And if you're listening and you do that, stop it. That's not only is it crass and just demonstrates poor judgment on your part, but this is a communicable disease. You wish it upon the people that you don't like, and that's just going to spread it around to more people that you do. So just keep it to yourself. Dave, I do think we have a fantastic global leader in Canada. Her name is Chrystia Freeland. Our actual prime minister. So
I can hear the unsubscribe clicks.
Derek, your final thoughts.
It's hard to find a voice. It's hard for anyone to find their voices right now who aren't just supporting authority and oppositions, medias, kooks like me who just are paranoid of whatever the government's doing. It's a difficult time when there's this very much a rally around the flag, rally around the leader mentality. Anywhere in the world right now, when you're facing anything where anytime anyone feels society feels besieged, we become more deferential to authority, to the state, to government, to leaders, and it's a natural human reaction because we're looking for something that's comforting. We're looking for this paternal figure, and people are doing it around the world. And oppositions are frustrated because they have a hard time finding their voice in this. But they shouldn't disappear. They should be not critical. There's a place for the NDP in Alberta with a voice. It's probably just not doing what they're doing. But at the same time, I'm afraid of oppositions becoming too uncritical, of media becoming too uncritical, and us because we're in this kind of siege mentality. Everyone is so eager to grant extraordinary powers to governments, and not just about telling people to stay in their houses temporarily, but that the overall massive expansion of the state into other areas of the economy and our social lives that we might not get back. And it's important right now that we have a critical media and we have critical opposition politicians who are not going to be granting blank checks because I think not just in Canada but around the world, governments are growing much more powerful, and they're not going to be handing much of this back in the near future.
You're muted.
Thank you so much. Derek, on that note, we will wrap it up. Just wanted to say before we go, if you're still gainfully employed and you would like to support independent media, please go to the westernstandardonline.com and become a member today. We are very grateful for all of our members, and I know it's a difficult time for everybody, but if you think this is important, then we will continue to bring this to you. On behalf of everybody at the Western Standard, but especially Derek, Deirdre, and Dave, we hope everybody stays healthy and well, and we will come to you each weekend for the foreseeable future. And hope everybody, including our leaders in this country, get through this crisis. Mm-hmm. All the best.
Cheers.